and not to teach it. I could never have been like him, but he really got me started to really like history. And when I was in high school, we had what was called the Youth Heritage Society. And we were sort of a mini Monroe County Historical Society, junior. And we were involved. We volunteered at the museum. We volunteered at the EB Cabin, the country store, when that was the country store, Paper Mill School. So I just really, really liked history and have enjoyed it. Mary Kay took over the Youth Heritage Society. Wilma Price was our advisor, and then she, retired, and Mary Kay Hamilton took over that group. And then it disbanded. Anyways, so I attended Lake Superior State College. I received a bachelor's in history up in Sault Ste. Marie, which was a great, great school. I really enjoyed it, had a wonderful time. One thing I like to tell people is if you had a little patch of blue sky up at the Sioux, it was all going to clear up and you're going to have big, huge blue sky. Here, you don't even get blue sky. I received my master's in historic preservation from Colorado State University. And at that time, Eastern Michigan was starting a program, and I was torn, do I want to go to Ypsi or Colorado? So it wasn't much of a choice, it didn't take me long to figure out what I wanted. Then I worked at the Historical Museum. I sort of had an in with Matt Swillick. He was the director, only because during high school I had volunteered. So that helped me, him know me, get in there. I was hired as the archivist, and then in 2011, the county was, cutting people left and right, and the museum director and assistant directors were let go. And so we were down to 2.5 staff members. And so that was a couple of hard times. But then the first millage passed, and we were golden. And then I had a friend who was working at the Battlefield Foundation. And she's like, well, come and work with me. And I'm like thinking it's a volunteer position. I'm like, no, that's okay. And, I need this. Well, it turned out I was making, for 4 days a week, I was making more money with her than I was 5 days a week after 20 odd years at the museum for the county. So I switched. I only worked there for a couple years. We got a new director there. They were into everything computer. And I was just like, I'm old enough to get my pension from the county, so I'm out of here. And I've been having a great time ever since. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the ethnic history of Monroe County. The definition of ethnic is pertaining to or characteristic of a people, especially a group sharing a common and distinctive culture, religion, language, or the like. A group of people sharing a common country of origin. I'm going to discuss some of the ethnic groups found in Monroe County. Now, archaeologists and historians estimate that bands of Paleo-Indians, numbering about 20 to 40 people, likely crisscrossed Monroe County, hunting caribou, gathering plants, although they couldn't definitely identify individual tribes until after the French explorer René de La Salle explored the area for New France in 1679. The indigenous people took advantage of the plentiful food and easy water transportation along the shores of Lake Erie and the banks of the River Raisin. Paleo Indians probably used the area as a crossroads, a campsite, village for centuries before La Salle and other Europeans discovered the Great Lakes. The city of Monroe unearthed more recent proof of Native American imprints between 1999 and 2003, when it commissioned several excavations at the northwest corner of North Dixie Highway and East Elm Avenue. Archaeologists discovered artifacts revealing that Native Americans were here between 1550 and 1650. When they dug for the fountain in Laranger Square. They came across a burial site there, and so they moved those remains to Ann Arbor. Native American tribes that have been associated historically with Monroe County are woodland tribes such as the Potawatomi, Odawa, Wyandot, Ojibwe. The Potawatomi were part of a long-term alliance called the Council of Three Fires with the Ojibwe and Ottawa. They had common or similar language, manners, customs. That's the Council of Three Fires. Early on, they were estimated to have numbered about 8,000 people. Potawatomi tribe originally lived on the east coast of the United States. According to their traditions, they moved west after receiving a message from the spirit world. Potawatomi history is marked by tribal expansion and transformation from a hunter-gatherer culture to a farming culture. Before Europeans came, the tribe lived near the rivers and the lakes of lower Michigan. The shores of Lake Erie and the river Raisin, known as Namasippi, or River of Sturgeon, was a gathering place for the natives. Even in the early, well, at least the 1800s for sure, maybe into the 1900s, there was so much sturgeon in the River Raisin that they would just stack it up like cordwood. They're just long, very long fish. They also would gather fruit here, dry and smoke fish, and hunt game. The women farmed. They grew corn, beans, and squash, sunflowers for seeds. The men hunted wild game, such as rabbit, deer, wild turkeys, and they, of course, caught an abundance of fish in the rivers and lakes. At least 2 Indian villages occupied the site of Monroe. Eventually, a depot for fur traders, the Northwest Company, was established here. The area was visited by French missionaries and explorers. Word spread of the abundant food and easy transport along Lake Erie and the River Raisin. After contact with the French, the natives replaced their canoes with horses and became fur traders and hunters. Due to a series of treaties and white settlement on their land, many Potawatomi were relocated to the south central states. Today, the Potawatomi are scattered throughout the Midwest and prairie states. Some live on reservations, but many live in cities and rural areas. The 2 decades following the War of 1812 witnessed the end of the Potawatomi residing in Michigan, followed by the Michigan Territory being populated by American immigrants. Because the Potawatomi had sided with the British during the War of 1812, American authorities viewed them as, well, with suspicion. They didn't trust them. They felt that they were a threat to the settlement between Detroit and Lake Michigan. Pioneers to the area who interacted directly with them characterized them as peaceful and not at all warlike to the white men. In case of the Potawatomi Indian Removal Act of 1830 meant that the majority of the tribe left their homelands for reservations west of the Mississippi River. Not all Potawatomi were willing to go west to reservations, and some fled to Canada and northern Michigan. The relocation process lasted from 1835 to 1867, and the Huron Potawatomi moved from southern Michigan to Kansas during the removal period. So I talked about the French. Well, they weren't directly from France. They were French Canadians. They came to Canada. The French came to Canada to colonize the region for fur trading and to avoid religious persecution. Antoine Cadillac landed on the site of present-day Detroit in 1701. French communities were established to provide a regional source of provisions for trading and military settlements in the Great Lakes. In 1759, the British captured Montreal, and all remaining French posts were handed over to the British. Increased population and immigration of the Detroit area by British, Irish, Scotch, Dutch, and Germans drove a lot of the young French habitants to leave Detroit, and many headed south and ended up here. We have a. The area became known as Frenchtown. Settlers established homesteads facing the river and creeks of the area, with their land stretching out behind them. And if there's a map back there, shows you the ribbon farms, and they were like ribbon farms. The river raisin was their highway, and their homes would face the river, and then the land would go back. And the story is that, you know, they would take a jug of whiskey and start from their back door and just walk. And as soon as the whiskey was done or they passed out, that's how far their land went back. So I know that one. Some of these river farms still exist. Munson Park stretches to Stewart Road, as did the IHM land before Lazy Boy built their new headquarters on Stewart Road. Dividing riverfront and lakeshore land into narrow ribbon farms provided important advantages to the farmer. Each farmer had access to water, and that was their main transportation route. The layout placed each farmhouse a minimum distance from the other, so you know they can communicate news to each other, tell what was going on, and also raise the alarm if they were under attack. Quick access to neighbors made dances, sledding parties, and other social gatherings easy to organize and attend. Is that in here? It's later on. Okay. French agriculture in Michigan was quite different from what the British did in America. Agricultural economy of French Michigan revolved around the production of wheat, corn, grains, hemp, and grass for forage. Gardens supplemented farms. Fruit orchards supplied an important part of their diet. For instance, when Francois Navarre left Detroit in 1787 to establish a new settlement on the River Alraison, he made sure to fill his saddlebag with a number of small pear trees that he would plant on his new plots of land and distribute to the inhabitants of the new settlement. A majority of the French settlers were farmers, and many were fur traders, dealing with Native Americans in Ohio and Indiana. Traders themselves lived in the Indian villages over the winter, and in early spring exchanged goods for furs and skins that were eventually shipped to Detroit and Montreal. Others supported traders and Indians with blacksmithing and silver work, and others worked transporting trade goods and furs and skins by boat and pack horse. There's the settlement. In 1802, a Frenchtown tax list numbered 152 heads of family owning property in the River Raisin region, with a population estimated about 628 people, with the majority having French names. About 9% of families were Scots-Irish, Welsh, German, or British, or other non-French nationalities. The battles of the River Raisin in January of 1813 during the War of 1812 resulted in a major loss of property and life. The area was devastated, and many families fled to Detroit and Sandusky. Those who remained were without adequate food and housing, and it took 10 years for Frenchtown to recover. In 1817, Frenchtown was officially renamed Monroe, and Monroe County was organized. I have to say that the Postmaster General in Washington, D.C. Did not officially recognize the name change for a few years. There was a collection of letters at the museum from the Postmaster General and the local postmaster. And the U.S. postmaster indicates that he felt there were too many towns named Monroe, of course, President Monroe, there were, and that the correspondence between the two men finally, the local guy convinced the Washington, D.C. man to change it. Now, and finally, 1826 is when he agreed to change from Frenchtown to Monroe. And I did some research in Washington, D.C. to see if the letters from the Monroe postmaster were kept, and because at the Library of Congress, there was a collection of letters that the Postmaster General had, but there was nothing there to know what his compelling argument was, other than probably, we have more than just French here, let us be American. There was a land office established here in 1823, and new settlers arrived in Monroe, changing its character from French Canadian to a multi-ethnic composition. In 1825, the opening of the Erie Canal, connecting the Great Lakes with the Atlantic seaboard, brought many Yankees to the community. After the War of 1812, the West was opened up to settlement. Schooners became the predominant vessels on the Great Lakes, bringing land speculators and settlers. One of Michigan's earliest railroad lines ran from La Pleasance Bay through Monroe along First Street west to Adrian. Anybody remember the tracks on First? Well, that's where they got their start back then. Most of Michigan's settlers came from the Northeast, New England, and New York. One route here was once an Indian trail, and it passed along the southern shore of Lake Erie by way of Erie, Pennsylvania, and Cleveland. It went past Sandusky and Miami Bay, then north through the Black Swamp. And if they were lucky, they got through the Black Swamp. A corduroy road, which is made up of planks and sometimes just whole trees, made travel through the Black Swamp barely passable. The best way to travel was the lake. But it was very slow to go through the Black Swamp. It took maybe 1 mile a day to get through. It was thick with mud, infested with mosquitoes. Trenches were built finally in the 1840s to drain it. And then another overland route was through Canada along the northern shore of Lake Erie. So there's Frenchtown, War of 1812. Here we have the Erie Canal. That brought a huge influx of immigrants to Monroe. The Erie Canal is 363-mile waterway, connects the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean via the Hudson River in upstate New York. The channel, which traverses New York State from Albany to Buffalo onto Lake Erie, was considered an engineering marvel at that time. It first opened in 1825. It provided a direct water route from New York City to the Midwest, which triggered a large-scale commercial and agricultural development, as well as immigration, of course. This brought a lot of people to the, up until then, sparsely populated frontiers of Western New York, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and points further west. Canal transformed New York City into an economic powerhouse, and in 2000, the U.S. Congress designated the Erie Canal a National Heritage Corridor. An immigrant from New York recalled that when he arrived on the River Raisin in 1823, he said, "There were no white inhabitants 10 miles west of Monroe. The French Canadians dressed more like Indians than white people." Edward Ellis, who was another New Yorker, and he started our first newspaper here, he stated, "The early settlers were of a class almost entirely devoid of enterprise. They were content with seating themselves upon the fertile banks of the rivers, watching the fish as they glided in the waters, and cultivate their lands barely sufficient to supply their own wants." To the New York farmer and Connecticut merchant, this seemed like a really terrible life, just wretched. And hate to say that the French were lazy, but Edward Ellis seemed to think so. When the Yankees came, Monroe became more civilized. Elections were held, something the French Canadians didn't really care about. Improvements were made to roads and bridges were built. The mouth of the River Raisin was straightened. It became called they called it the Government Canal was built. Fishing and lumber and paper industries flourished. We had a few African Americans here early. William Wells Brown is one. They came from eastern United States with the Yankees that came to the area. 1820 census has 9 blacks living in the county. 1827 lists 13. 1830 census has 18, and the 1834 has, 1834 has 34 free persons of color and 2 slaves on that census. William Wells Brown was a noted Black abolitionist. He was a playwright and a novelist, and he related his experience as a barber here in 1835 in his book Clotel. He describes establishing a barbershop across the street from the only other barbershop in the city. He also relates how he printed his own money. At that time, there were many wildcat banks, and it sounded like he got along okay, but he didn't stay very long. He moved to New York after probably about a year here or so. 1840 census has the Duncanson family listed as free colored. Robert S. Duncanson was a famous landscape artist, and you'll hear more about him on the 21st if you come back. We have a program on him. But he spent his early adolescent and adult years in Monroe as a house painter. His family came here from New York, and Duncanson is considered the finest Black landscape artist in the 19th century. He's buried in Woodland Cemetery. There were other Black families here. I don't want to offend anybody, but one was the Foster family, and they assimilated and married whites, and now, a few years ago, one of their descendants was really outraged to be even put in the same category as, his ancestors, which is unfortunate. I mean, they did great things. African Americans escaping slavery and racial discrimination came to Michigan. During the Civil War, Aaron Bromley was a member of Company C, 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry. He enlisted for 1 year at the age of 28 and joined the regiment at Beaufort, South Carolina, October 11th, 1864. He was discharged for disability May 17th, 1865, and he moved to Monroe shortly after the war. He was a member of the Monroe GAR, and his grandson, Alcade, was a star Monroe High School athlete, a wonderful piano player. Of course, at that time, there were more African Americans living in Toledo, and so a lot of residents here, including Alcade, moved there when he was in his 20s, but he is buried in Monroe. Census records aren't always accurate concerning race. Sometimes schedules list a family as mulatto or Black some years, other years as white, went back and forth. Many of the African Americans found on 19th century census records have descendants still living in the county, but most are white by the 20th century census rolls. Many current African American families in Monroe County moved here from the South during the Great Migration, which was 1910 to 1970. And they came here to work in factories and mills. Whoop, wrong one. Oh well. The Great Migration during the 20th century, many communities in the South, people came up here to work in factories. At the turn of the 20th century, the vast majority of Black Americans lived in southern states, but from 1916 to 1917, it's estimated that 6 million Black Southerners relocated to urban areas in the North and West. And of course, they came for the auto factories, paper mills, what was going on. The massive stream of European immigration to the United States, which had begun in the late 19th century, waned during World War I. It slowed to a trickle with immigration reform in the 1920s. As a result, urban industries were faced with labor shortages, and a huge internal population shift among African Americans addressed these shortfalls, particularly during the World Wars when defense industries required more unskilled labor. Although the Great Migration slowed during the Great Depression, it surged again after World War II, when the rates of migration were high for several decades. Push factors for the exodus were poor economic conditions in the South, exacerbated by the limitations of sharecropping, farm failures, crop damage from the boll weevil, as well as ongoing racial oppression in the form of Jim Crow laws. Pull factors to the north included encouraging reports of good wages, good living conditions that spread by word of mouth and that appeared in African American newspapers, with advertisements for housing and employment and firsthand stories of newfound success in the north. The Chicago Defender newspaper, for example, became one of the leading promoters of the Great Migration. In addition to Chicago, other cities that absorbed large numbers of migrants included Detroit, Cleveland, and New York City. They were all seeking better civil and economic opportunities. Many blacks were not wholly able to escape racism by migrating to the north, where they were segregated into ghettos and urban life introduced new obstacles. Newly arriving migrants even encountered social challenges from the black establishment in the north, which tended to look down on the country manners of the newcomers. So even among their own population, they were that. When I was at Cantrick, we had one black teacher, and he was looking at a house on Arbor Avenue, which would have been north of Cantrick. The realtor was unwilling to even show him that house. So later, his wife, who was white, had the grand red carpet spread out for her to go look at that house. The realtor was more than willing to sell to her. So they didn't last long in Monroe. They just weren't welcome. So after the War of 1812, the area was open to exploration and settlement. And the Irish here in 1834 attempted to organize an English-speaking Catholic church. A cluster of Irish immigrants settled in Monroe County, and at first they shared St. Antoine's Church, which was a forerunner of St. Mary's. At that time, it was located on West Noble and North Monroe Street. But then later, St. Mary's moved to their present location on Elm, and that church, the other church, was torn down. These Irish Catholics didn't build their own church, St. John the Baptist Church, until 1872. In colonial times, the Irish population in America was second in number only to the English. Many early Irish immigrants were of Scottish or English descent and came from the northern province of Ulster. Pushed out of Ireland by religious conflicts, lack of political autonomy, and dire economic conditions, these immigrants, who were often called the Scotch Irish, were pulled to America by the promise of land ownership and greater religious freedom. Many Scotch Irish immigrants were educated, skilled workers. Even those who financed their emigration by becoming indentured servants were well equipped to lead successful, independent lives when their period of servitude ended. So what do you think the largest ethnic group is in the county? German, that's right. German immigration boomed in the 19th century. There was wars in Europe and America, and it slowed the arrival of immigrants for several decades, starting in the 1770s. But by 1830, German immigration had increased more than tenfold. And from that year until World War I, almost 90% of all German immigrants chose the United States as their destination. Once established here, they, would write to their families and friends and tell them, describing their new home and the opportunities that were here. So those letters were circulated in German newspapers and books, prompting chain migrations. And by 1832, more than 10,000 immigrants arrived in the U.S. from Germany. By 1854, it had jumped to nearly 200,000 immigrants. Michigan also established a foreign emigration agency to encourage foreign-born people to come to the state. And locally, a gentleman by the name of John Reisig traveled back and forth to Germany, encouraging people to come and settle in Monroe County. A wave of Germans immigrated to the U.S. after the revolutions of 1848 failed to establish a democracy. This and economic hardship caused thousands to leave Germany and settle in America. And these immigrants were often professionals such as Dr. Edward Dorsch. My heritage is German. A group of brothers came to Monroe County in the 1850, around 1850. Some of the brothers settled in the county. My direct ancestor settled in the city. He was a blacksmith. And so we have the country culls and the city culls. But German people are one of the largest groups who emigrated to the United States. And by 1870, German-born farmers made up 1/3 of the agricultural industry in rural areas in the whole country. Ties to Monroe County and Germany lasted for generations. I noticed when I was doing some research in a pre-World War I, but almost World War I newspaper, the Germans were, warned, don't be speaking German, speak English, we have our eyes on you. They were afraid of, people, spies, whatever, coming in. And ties to Monroe County and Germany have lasted for generations. At the museum, when I first started working there was a gentleman, George Bartley. He was a World War II veteran. He had been captured during World War II and was in Germany. And when they found out he was from Monroe, Michigan, they started questioning him and naming names of Monroe people. And George was just shocked. Of course, he was from Tennessee, and so he was really shocked. But, he's just sort of like, how do they know all these Monroe people? He couldn't figure it out. And there was just that there was so much, communication between the two settlements, two countries, people. The Ilgenfritz family was one of two families in the area that established nursery businesses that lasted for generations. They hired members of many ethnic groups, including the Italians, the Irish, the Serbians. Today, Germans make up the largest ethnic group in Monroe County. There's other ethnic groups that migrated to the U.S. in the 1840s. Land shortage, political unrest, and potato famine were reasons for Belgians to come here. Also, there was a Catholic priest here from Belgium, which may have influenced some to make the long journey here. Italians, prior to World War I, there were approximately 600 Italians living in Monroe. The war stopped that immigration, but immediately after the war, this is World War I, immigration resumed and the number of Italian families greatly increased between 1919 and 1926. The Christopher Columbus Society was organized to help the Italians take care of their own. The society's primary purpose was to establish a sick, accident, and death benefit fund, sort of like an insurance policy. The society helped the Italians locate to Monroe, get housing, get jobs, just start on their way to citizenship. There was a school plan for the Italian children and the establishment of St. Joseph's Church, where Oaks of Righteousness is today, was means to that end, to get a school for them. This ethnic group worked in the nurseries and paper mills, and they also owned beverage distribution businesses and cement businesses. Eastern Europeans also had their own ethnic organizations. During World War II, there was a Romanian American Defense Club made up of first and second generation Romanians in Monroe. Members purchased war bonds and they held fundraisers for the Red Cross, and they assisted members in obtaining citizenship. During World War II, there was a POW camp in Dundee. It didn't last real long, a few months, but it was mostly Germans there. They were Nazi soldiers. They were put to work in the local canneries and other businesses. And some of the POWs that were Italian worked for Greening Nursery. Some American-born Japanese were sent here from the West Coast. And the men often sent for their families to join them. They weren't kept in barbed wire camps. They had homes. They worked for, many of them worked for Greening. They would live in housing that was owned by Greening Nursery Company. And they had freedom to work other jobs too, as long as they reported their whereabouts to the government. So the Japanese had a little different experience. Of course, they were American citizens, so why shouldn't they? Serbians organized and had their own hall on Conant Avenue. This group wanted to keep alive their native traditions and maintain close relations to their church, the Greek Orthodox. So up until 1950, they would meet in Detroit. They would attend church there. And after that, they would meet in a hall or members' homes. And the present church on North Monroe Street, the cornerstone was laid in 1959, and the church was dedicated in 1960. So we have Southerners that came. Many from the South came to Monroe in the 1920s, a lot from Tazewell County, Tennessee, others from Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky. Employment and economic opportunity offered by paper mills and auto industry brought about this migration. There's also a return migration to the South, especially during times of layoff or prolonged unemployment. They'd go back home. Even today, family members go back between their roots in the South and their homes in Monroe. Probably about, I don't know, maybe less than 5 years ago, my son bought a house in Avalon Beach. And the couple that he bought it from were not local people. They had no ties to Tazewell other than they were going to retire there. And they commented when they did the closing on the house, people in Tazewell, Tennessee knew exactly where their house was in Monroe, Michigan. They were just, in for a surprise once they got ingrained in that community down there. Another group that came here were the Jewish population. They were closely tied with Canadian fur trading in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Records show that the first Jew to settle in Monroe was probably Ezekiel Peltier. That sounds pretty French. He was a fur trader, 1846. He was born in Detroit in 1799, and he was the son of Isidore Peltier, a French fur trader, and Sophia Solomon. Sophia's father, Ezekiel, was an English fur trader who had settled at Fort Michilimackinac in the late 18th century. Another early Jewish settler in Monroe was a man named Solomon, a cousin of Ezekiel's. He arrived at approximately the same time as Ezekiel Peltier. And like many of the fur traders, he married a Native American woman from a local tribe, and she was known as Catherine LaSavage. There are many LaSavage families today, as well as Peltiers, and various spellings of each, although as far as I know, none of them are Jewish today. The religious life of early settlers was harsh and demanding. To attend services for the high holidays, holy days, required a long trip by canoe. The settlers would travel up waterways to Detroit to reach their shul. I'm talking about the Jewish folks. Once the holy days were concluded, they had to leave immediately for the return trip. Return trip was a risk. They didn't want to get caught in the winter snows. After 1840s, a number of German Jews arrived in Monroe, and before this time, there were approximately 10 to 12 Jewish families. In the later half of the 19th century, another 10 or so families arrived from Germany. Louis Friedenberg was a native of Bohemia, and Solomon Meyerfield were the only German Jewish settlers in Monroe before 1850. Friedenberg and Meyerfeld owned a clothing store, and Friedenberg's daughter was married in Monroe in approximately 1880 in the first Jewish wedding ceremony held here. A rabbi was called in from Detroit. He spent the week in Monroe, and they had their marriage. After about spending 40 years in Monroe, Friedenberg and his family left and they moved to Detroit. This is the interior of the B'nai Israel temple that serves the city's small Jewish population. In the early 1900s, most Jews who arrived in Monroe were related and came from the same area of the Ukraine and Russia. They came to Monroe because they had family connections. The first known Jewish family to settle in Monroe in the 20th century was Jacob Seps. Mr. and Mrs. Seps emigrated from their native Russia to Monroe, and he started a scrap iron business. For a while, the family lived in Dundee, and after Jacob passed away in 1921, Mrs. Seps moved her family of 6 children to Toledo in order to provide her children with a Jewish education and to be near a larger Jewish family. Among other early settlers who arrived were the Petermans, who ran a grocery store, the Goldbergs, who ran a clothing store. Isadore Gooderman, who arrived in Monroe in 1906, was a horse trader. Benjamin and Anna Taxon, relatives of the Guttermans, also came in approximately 1906, and they came via Wauseon, Ohio, and Dundee. Their daughter Sally was born in 1911 and taught Sunday school here in Dundee for years, starting in 1929. Probably should be Saturday school, but somewhere it said Sunday school. But in 1933, she married Francis Rush, and they ran a clothing store. So I don't know if anybody remembers the Rush's store. Yes. Harris Sachs arrived in Monroe in 1915 from New York City. Soon afterwards, he sent for his wife, Yetta, and their 5 children, including their 5-month-old son, Ted. Sachs was a peddler who sold goods door to door. He attempted farming, but his wife didn't want to leave the city for the fruit farm which he had bought on the outskirts of town. So after selling the farm, Mr. Sachs began to buy the contents of houses in Monroe from people who were moving out. And from there, he became involved in the furniture business. Got their furniture today. And it's been in business for over 70 years. Often he had to barter with people who couldn't pay, and often farmers paid with chickens. The furniture, as you know, the furniture is still in business today, but I doubt if Harris would take chickens. I don't know. In the first few decades of the 1900s, Monroe's Jewish population was at its height with approximately 30 families. While there was no distinct Jewish neighborhood, most lived on the east side of town. Families were very close-knit, and many were related and visited with each other often. Families would gather together for Passover and other holidays. As congregations formed in Toledo, many of them traveled from Monroe to attend some kind of service there, either Reform or Orthodox. And for the strict Orthodox, the trip to shul would mean several days away from home. After World War II, the Jewish population in Monroe began to decline. Although the Jewish population has always been small in comparison to the total population, there's never been an absence of leaders from the Jewish community. In 1953, concern about the need for a new synagogue in Monroe began to arise. Several members of the Jewish community joined together and contacted other Jewish families in Monroe, and they agreed to build their own synagogue. And in 1954, Temple B'nai Israel was built on the corner of Custer and 8th Streets. And today, this small community serves about 22 families. We also had some Mexicans. Migrant farm workers from Mexico came to Michigan in the 1960s. Michigan's food system is the second most important industry in the state. More than 1 in 5 state jobs stem from agriculture. A critical part of Michigan's farming economy is availability, timeliness, and professional skills of migrant seasonal workers. In the 1970s, the Monroe County Health Department set up a number of health clinics for these migrant workers on South Telegraph. There's a building that used to be state police posts. They had a health clinic there. Some of the workers have stayed in the area, but I know many of them who have permanently moved to Toledo. Although not a large percentage of county residents, Hispanic people are part of the county fabric. The history of an area has very common themes. We've got family relationships, economic incentives, religious freedom, escape from oppression, environmental factors, better living conditions, political freedom, wanting to get a better education, and some hardy souls are nomads and have a wanderlust and they just keep moving around. So what's your ethnic background? Bunch of them? Right. Yeah, German, yeah. That's all I have. I thank you very much. Yes? Do you have a Spanish mass? That's great.
So there must be.
And there's that church on Front across from the Sawyer Homestead that's Hispanic. Yeah, yeah. We have a Hispanic pastor at our church. It'd be neat if you would do a Spanish. Yeah, yeah. Our pastor is Spanish at the Methodist Church, St. Paul's. Yes.
Does anybody remember Monroe Evening News back in the 60s had front page? If it weren't for Tazewell, Tennessee, there would be no Monroe News. I still have the paper.
Do you really?
My German relatives came from Germany to Tazewell.
Oh.
Half my Tazewell relatives went to Monroe, to the paper mill, the
Okay.
etc.
Yeah.
But when in the 50s, I had an Italian neighbor who worked for a cement company, and he cemented his ditch, and all the neighbors complained, and Frenchtown made him remove the cement from the ditch.
Wow.
That just reminded me of something. My brother-in-law was from Tazewell, and I used to teach him and tell him that in the school down there, they taught them the 3 R's: reading, writing, and a route to Monroe.
A route to Monroe. A route to Monroe. Route to Monroe. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Oh.
Hello, I'm Jeff. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. It was wonderful as always. Want to thank everybody for coming out again tonight. It's a real nice crowd. We have 3 more coming up. It'll be Monday. We're going to be talking about General Winchester and his regulars. And then on Thursday night, the 20th, we're going to be talking about Monroe County and the Civil War. And then on Friday, we'll be talking about Robert Duncanson and photography. And thank you for coming out again. And like us on Facebook, Monroe County Historic Society. We're on Facebook. And these are being recorded live right now. And there's 3 of them up online that you can watch if you've missed the ones. Okay? Thank you.